Good evening, everyone. I want to welcome all of you to the concluding event of our open house for admitted students, and thank our visitors for taking the time to come to Yale to look us over. It was our pleasure to meet with you, and I know that our faculty and students join me excuse me, in hoping that you like what you have seen. We congratulate you and are confident that in the next few days, you will make the right decision about your future education. And I suppose you'll say, and we'll make the right decision about your financial aid, but we'll talk about that later. Yale's celebration of talent in all its diversity is a continuing and ongoing tradition. It takes many forms. The university commissions important buildings that both complement and contrast with what went before. Our school consistently brings leading architects to lecture and teach, who may disagree among each other about how to proceed in architecture, yet share the passion for architecture as an art. But first and foremost, our job at the School of Architecture is to nurture talent and to enable intelligence. Consequently, we seek out the most talented students who show the greatest potential for the kind of independent thinking necessary for professional leadership. Last Thursday, from this podium, can we have the slides, please? Last Thursday, from this podium, I shared some thoughts and memories of Zaha Hadid, Norman R. Foster Visiting Professor, my friend and our colleague who died unexpectedly 7 days ago. We were all shocked. We remain so. Our school enjoyed a long relationship and spirited collaboration with Professor Hadid, including this spring term. Over many years, she led advanced studios in our school. In 2006, she received an honorary degree from the university. Since her death, many have remembered Professor Hadid as a creative and path-breaking visionary, a role model for women in the profession, and an uncompromising artist possessing a razor-sharp intellect. She is very much missed. When Zaha came down with the bronchitis that ultimately felled her, Patrick Schumacher, her brilliant design partner, who is also teaching with the studio, agreed to step in and deliver a talk for this evening. But with the sad turn of events, Patrick has to be in London this week, seeing to the memorial for Professor Zaha Hadid and innumerable other tasks, as you can well imagine. To honor our beloved colleague, I am very grateful to Frank Gehry, Saarinen Visiting Professor, to Peter Eisenman, Charles Gwathmey Professor in Practice, and to Dean-Designate Deborah Berke, 3 senior distinguished members of our faculty, each of whom enjoyed strong personal and long-lived histories with Zaha. I want to thank them for agreeing at relatively short notice to undertake this conversation in this evening. So without further ado, I would like to turn the evening over to Professor Mark Gage, who will serve as interlocutor to this evening's conversation in honor of our friend and our colleague, Zaha Hadid. Mark Gage and the guests, please.
Thank you, Bob. This is, of course, an impossible task to try to fill in the gap left by Zaha, not only in architecture, but today. I wanted to just tell one kind of funny anecdote about the last time she gave a lecture here. Usually, I've been teaching here for about 16 years, and when people give lectures, they usually save their flagship projects to the very end. So you can usually count on something really big showing up around the 50-minute in a lecture. And Zaha, in a typical fashion, showing 400 slides in rapid fire succession, had hit that level of flagship project by like minute 8. And I was sitting in the third row, and Cesar Pelli and Leon Creer were sitting in front of me. And I could swear simultaneously at the same time, they both turned at each other and like Macaulay Culkin in Home Alone were like, they could not believe how much work she had and how quickly she was going through it. And they continued to talk about it later at the reception. So a lecture by Zaha was a real event. It was a very fast-paced event, and it was really overwhelming the amount of work and energy she put into her work in these talks.
So it's going to take 3 of us.
Yes. Well, no, 3.5. I'm not. I like how Bob introduced the 3 distinguished senior faculty. And the guy with the big wheel. But it's a real pleasure, and I'd like to thank you all. I have a couple of questions, which
Good luck trying to steer this group.
Oh, I know. I'm pretty much going to, throw a piece of meat to the lions and run away. And, lioness. No. Ooh. Isn't it more gender appropriate to call it an actor instead of an actress? No.
Then we're all lionesses.
They're all lionesses.
Yeah.
Ooh, I like that. There you go. Yes. Well, I'm with you, sister.
I like that.
So it's hard to imagine an architectural world without Zaha Hadid in it. Certainly you guys have been in the game much longer than I have. And I wanted to start by asking Frank first, because we had talked about this very briefly on the phone the other day, but when Zaha came on your radar, and so we could get a little bit of backstory on how she entered the profession, and then maybe we can segue that to further conversation about education and practice down the road. But
Well, it's hard to do this, to talk about her. I think all of us loved her very much, and she was a good friend. And one of the things we shared was teaching at Yale. I think that this has been a home to characters like us to meet and play with the students that come here. And I used to try to schedule my teaching gigs here with her being here, as Greg Lynn did, so we could spend time together, because it was a big deal. I was doing the Vitra Museum in Basel, in Weil am Rhein, Switzerland. And the owner had hired Grimshaw first, then me, and Ando, and then he was going to build another warehouse, and I convinced him to hire Cesar Alvaro. And then they were doing a firehouse, and we all sort of had just heard about Zaha's winning the peak competition. Now, I may have the dates and the times all screwed up. It might have been 15 years in between those events. So forgive me, but this is how I remember it. And Rolf, being a very open and generous guy and very intellectually stimulated by the likes of us guys, us people, was open to at least talking to her about doing the firehouse, even though it was, at that point, I don't think she'd built anything except winning the competition. And so a lot of discussion about backing her up with the proper team to help her do the building. And it seemed all right. Everything was going good. She made models, and you've all seen the building. It's a pretty, for a first building, it's a pretty thrilling piece of work. And Christine Fire-Ice from Berlin was also conspiring with me to help her. And I got a call about 3-4 months into it from the client saying, "Oh my God, it's not working." So guess what? Zaha couldn't be corralled by anybody. The poor local architect, even at that stage. And so we all had to jump in and get her on the right track. But she built it, and built it well. There was a little bit of a sag in one of the beams. Wasn't her fault. A Swiss engineer made a mistake.
It's never the architect's fault.
No,
right?
no. And then the damn firemen didn't want to move into it. And it really worked. I mean, it really worked as a firehouse, I swear. I guarantee you it worked. And they didn't want to move into it. And I think really Rolf wanted to use it as an exhibit center. But that got her started. She got a parking garage or something next to it, or down the street in the same town. Then she got the ski lift,
In Cincinnati.
and she took off
Yeah.
like a rocket. How did she do it? How'd she do it, Peter? I mean, she went from that to about 400 people working all over the world. And pretty much good stuff, some of it really great. And great architect, I think.
So Deborah,
Absolutely
you went
great
to the AA at the same time Zaha was there.
That's
Yeah.
right. We were
Any-
classmates in Rem and Ilya's unit, and to whoever said earlier today, Ilya's like there all the time. That was true then too. I was a visitor for 1 year at the AA, and Zaha obviously got her architectural education there. And she was, Frank and I were talking about this earlier today, she wasn't wearing Prada and Issey Miyake then. She kind of made her own clothes. But she was as dramatic, sort of spectacularly dramatic in her presence at the school then as a student as she became in the profession itself.
She had that confidence then?
I didn't know her well enough to know whether she had the confidence or she was capable then of pretending to have the confidence,
Same
which in
thing.
architecture I think can be the same thing.
Yeah.
She certainly had the talent.
Yeah.
She had the talent, for sure.
But you know, later on in her career, that way of presenting herself, people started calling her diva this and diva that and all that crap. But that wasn't her. I mean, that was her, the way she dressed and things, but
That
She was
who
much warmer
that
than
was
I
who-
think people realized
she was a
person.
Well, she could be brusque. Wait, I mean, I mean, let's not.
Oh, here we go, Peter's going.
Well, I mean, not to me, but
She
I
loved you, Peter.
Yeah, there were times when her public behavior was, you could say, problematic. I mean, when you weren't with her, you could be far away again her.
Wait, were we talking about her or you?
No. We could, we get confused sometimes. I think what we really ought to do is realize that this was an extraordinary person, number one. And I think that to me is more than anything I remember about Zaha when one would ever come to London, no matter how big or how small, etc. She was always going out of her way for one, number one. And she always called things like it was. Even with her success, she was able to look at her colleagues and to the other archistars, let's say, around, and say things that are really needed to be said, I think. She never held back. I think she was a terrific critic, you know, as well. And I thought she had an enormous integrity about even her former closest friends. And her commentaries on people were very accurate. And so as a person, I think what was part of her success was the magnetic condition of her personality. She may not have been a diva, but she was electric, right? And when she walked into the room, you know, she walked into the room, okay? With no question about it. She was never backstage. And I thought that was wonderful in her, and how much she had suffered. I mean, don't forget, for the longest period of time, and I'm not sure the difference between when I met her in '74, when she was around the Institute in New York, when Rem was there. I don't know what year.
I met her in 75 or 6, I can't quite remember.
Okay.
Yeah.
But there's a long time from the peak competition, let's say, to the Firehouse, to Cincinnati. I mean, Cincinnati was the
20
really...
years after the peak. Yeah.
What?
It was 20 years from the peak to Cincinnati.
Cincinnati. So, I mean, let's face it, there was a tough struggle for her remaining who she was in the environment that she was in, and don't forget she was in a colonial environment, and she chose to stay in London. I think there was an enormous energy that propelled her keeping moving for those 20 years, because some people would have given up. And I think Cincinnati was one of her triumphs, and you know, and that opened the floodgates, let's say. And I think she never looked back, but she never forgot who she was, how she had to struggle, how other people had to struggle. And, you know, I thought she was an enormously, a person of enormous integrity.
And who her friends were.
Huh?
And who knew who her friends were over the years.
That's it.
Yes.
Right. She never deserted those people, ever.
So that's not a diva.
Right.
No.
Well, I remember seeing this photograph from Philip Johnson's 90th birthday, I think. What year was that? I'll look to Bob, the history.
Born in 1906, so it was 1996.
Bob's like
Good at math, right.
yeah. Bob's like our personal Rain Man of architectural trivia. But in that picture, it's kind of striking because really there's like 20 guys. There's Frank and Peter and Jack Robertson and David Childs and Stanley Tigerman, and I'm leaving out like
I was even there.
Bob was there of course.
Where were we?
I think it was at the 4th season.
4 seasons.
Yeah, but it's literally like 20 of the most famous male white architects you could recognize, and then Zaha. They're wrapped in a white cape. And I remember seeing that and thinking, like, how did she break into, that's like not just the upper echelon of architecture. That's like the hallowed circle of New York architecture nonetheless, and her being from London. To kind of follow up on Frank's question, of course she was like immensely talented and overcame quite a few obstacles, not only being Arab, being a woman at that time and period, but how did she get from that position as a star student at the AA, winning a competition that wasn't ultimately built, to that stratosphere in less than really about, I think, 15 years, 10 or 15 years? What do you think it is that allowed her to be a comet? Joseph Giovannini wrote a piece where a eulogy where he starts out by saying Zaha was a comet. What do you think propelled that comet?
I would take a guess. a commitment to her work. She really believed in what she was doing. It was unique, original. It always had enormous energy, but I would argue commitment. And if she had integrity about people, I think she had commitment to the work. And I think it's a great lesson for future architects who are here. I mean, talking about that, I mean, I think it's really important to place her not in the professional, but what she would mean to somebody that's going to start architecture. And 80%, 90% of this audience are future architects. And to me, that commitment to being good, in of her own idea of what good was. And she wasn't going to tolerate mediocrity. That's what I mean. She was brusque when there were things that were mediocre about whatever she was in. Cynthia will tell you a story about when we were at any conference in Ankara, and she reminded me today that we were being housed somewhere. Cynthia can tell the story better. But she refused. It was student housing. And she said, "This is no good for anybody. We're not going to," and everybody said, "Yeah, this is no good." and Cynthia had to go and quickly find, hotels that would take these people. I mean, that's the kind of thing. She wouldn't accept mediocrity.
Yeah, but she made a commitment to learning how to build those things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that was no easy thing. She found the programs and the people that knew how to deliver, and she found that in Patrick as a partner, Patrick Schumacher.
So we keep mentioning I know the peak was obviously an incredibly pivotal moment in her career. And I guess the question is maybe for Deborah, taking over the school and thinking about the next generation of architects. I was thinking about the peak competition, and there's some interesting, I don't know if they're apocryphal stories, but I think it was her scheme had already been rejected, and Arati Isozaki rescued it from the pile, and the client came and said he wanted a building that looked like his new Lamborghini. Did you tell me this, or no? It looked like a new Lamborghini, so they pulled it, Arati Isozaki pulled it out of the pile, and the rest is history. But I was thinking about this because the Guggenheim Helsinki competition, in which every architect in the world was trying to recreate Frank's success in Bilbao, received 1,715 entries. So for this kind of young generation, just the facility with the computer, the ease of access of information, it's almost as if the competition as a vehicle has been taken off the table. Like if Zaha was graduating from school now with her talent and drive, how would she make her career in the absence of that avenue of a competition, do you think?
Well, she entered competition.
Right.
Yeah.
Still.
But
I don't think the competition is as limited in its opportunities as you presented by the Guggenheim example. I think there's still many opportunities in competitions, and the invited competition
that's the
broadly,
problem, getting invited.
but and I think Frank's role in Vitra is a key part of that story as well, that the way you move forward is to get support.
Yeah, that
People who
happened to me.
believe. And so the competition is a small part of that, and the support of your colleagues, your teachers, the people you've worked with, when you're really good and when you work really hard, that's how it begins to unfold.
All my first work came recommendations from other people in the design field.
Oh, yeah.
Architecture.
Mark, one of the things that characterizes her as really unique has to do with the term I spoke on here last fall, that is authority. And what's interesting about Zaha as opposed to other people, and I think it characterizes something very unique about her, as teachers, you can teach Le Corbusier. You can even teach Mies van der Rohe. You can teach Aldo Rossi. I mean, there are any number of acolytes who do Aldo Rossi in Italy today, probably better than Rossi. The one thing you could never do is teach Zaha, because it was so unique to her being and her artistic sensibility that even though she was an authority, it was an authority that could not be taught. And I think that tells you something very unique about her being. I mean, a lot of people can do Frank, right? A lot of people can do...
That's not true.
Easy.
No problem. Hey, a lot, there are more people that try and imitate Frank. Come on. That's
Trying is not succeeding.
I didn't, they use him as a model.
All right,
You
I agree
couldn't,
with that.
they do use Frank as a model. I was meaning that as a compliment, come on. I was saying that they don't use Zaha.
It's harder.
It's
What?
More personal signature.
Yeah, much harder, right?
yeah,
So that,
agree.
what Deborah was mentioning, that's something I had talked to a number of students today about, that kind of curating a network of allies and friends and mentors. And clearly Zaha had a guardian angel in Frank with the Vitra project. Were there any key mentors in your career moving forward? Were there any really, really important ones that you would like to credit?
Well, the names wouldn't mean, I don't
Yeah.
think.
Or were they teachers or colleagues? Or?
Fred Usher was a graphic designer, worked with Eames for a long time.
Mhm.
I worked with him at the Gruen office, close friends. He was called by Danziger to do a studio, and Danziger and Fred got me to do it.
Huh.
So that was the first building.
That's always the hardest one to get, it seems. Speaking from experience.
Then a lot of that came from people I worked with at Gruen's
Uh-huh.
that had worked with me for about 4 or 5 years.
Uh-huh.
And Philip Johnson. He could go both ways.
In more ways than
It
one.
was really, I saw the dynamite stick burning.
No, the funny story with Philip is, by accident, I made a lamp that looked like a fish, and it was, and Philip heard about it, and he and David Whitney, his partner, called me to have dinner, and they lectured me on, you mustn't do this, Frank. This is a negative thing to do in a starting career in architecture.
Whoops.
And then a week later, Aggie Gund asked me to make one for her brother who was getting engaged. And there was an engagement party in New York, and the fish lamp was there. And the next morning, I got a call from Jasper Johns, Philip Johnson, knew buying them, and Philip wanted one, so.
You know, when I was at my open house in the 90s, Philip Johnson was teaching here, teaching a studio in which Peter Eisenman was his TA. Right?
That's right.
For real. But I was, a little nervous, and I went up to the 6th floor and was running to get into the pit to see a review, and I ran smack into Philip Johnson, like chest to chest. And he kind of stood back, and he goes, well, where are you from? I said, well, I'm from Nebraska, sir. And he said, oh, son, you got it all wrong. This building says architecture on the front, not agriculture.
That's good.
It had a big impact on my career, too. I was actually looking for the agriculture school, so we changed that. But Peter, you also, I would imagine Philip Johnson was something of a mentor to you, but Colin Rowe also. Who were your big mentors and allies as you were founding your career?
I would say mentors, not allies. I think there's a big difference.
Okay.
Certainly, Colin was an enormous influence. I mean, and Tony can certainly attest to that. I think at a certain moment, Manfredo Tafuri was an enormous energy and influence, and at the end, let's say Jacques Derrida was. We spent a lot of time and did a project and a publication together. Those would be the three main outside influences, let's say, outside of Philip. I mean, Philip, there's no question that Philip was really important to the Institute and what we were doing there. He was, I mean, I can remember one of the great gestures of Philip, which is what ties you to these kinds of people. We had been working on House 10, and the client wanted to build the thing in the fall. And I told him, don't worry, we'll get the working drawings done during the summer. And that summer, I went with Bob Stern and others to Europe and messed around with the Biennale, if you remember, right? It was a marvelous time, and we had a great time. I came back from Italy, and the clients, there's the hole in the ground, no drawings, right? And so on the spot, he fired me, boom, like that. And this house was something we had put a lot of time in. And so I went to a dinner at the new members dinner at the Century Club, and I was sitting next to Philip, and he said to me, how's the house going, right? Which is what he would always ask his, friends and younger architects. And I said, it's dead. He said, what do you mean? I said, I got fired. He said, how much did you lose? I said, 10,000. And without saying anything, the next day, an envelope came from Philip's office, and I opened it, and there was a note that said, this is a long-term loan, don't worry about it, and there was $10,000.
Will you be my Philip?
I mean, that's
Ever to pay it forward? Karma?
I mean, that's it doesn't happen very often, but there it is. So you can call it, I mean.
That's a patron.
Yeah, no, it was more of he was a friend.
No, he looked after a lot of us.
Huh?
He looked
Not me.
after the bunch of us.
Yeah.
But
Deborah,
I'll
did you
answer
have
your question in
mentors?
a two-part answer. I would say mentors, and two of the three of them are here and might be surprised to hear this, are actually Tony, Peter, and Ken at the Institute, where I showed up as a very young woman having gone to art school. And it was like being immersed in a full-body dye bath of architecture.
I thought you were going to say maleness.
That too. No, there are actually a lot of wonderful women who worked there who went on to do great and interesting and important things. So there was that. That was immersion in architecture, in the indigo bath of architecture. And the other isn't from architects at all. Two people, and I'm going to use this to come back to Zaha. One, Will Miller from the Cummins Architecture Foundation, because I got a job out there, and that brought a level of visibility to my work that hadn't come previously, and that was a wonderful thing. And the support of patrons of architecture like that, I think, remains critical. And the other, and the reason this gets back to Zaha, is it's because it's about knowing what you believe, sticking with it, and saying it sometimes fiercely. I interviewed for a job in Louisville, Kentucky many years ago. I did not get the job, went to a small firm from California. 2 years later, my phone rang and voice on the phone said, I want to hire you to do a hotel for me. You won't remember me because I wasn't in the room. I was on the Polycom when you interviewed for that job in Kentucky, but I liked everything you had to say. I wrote it down. I have a project for you now. So to the point being made about Zaha, she knew what she believed. She wanted to go and do that. That's true for everybody here too. Learn and then know what you believe and hang on to it fiercely because it will get you work.
I know a couple people have written about that period in Zaha's life between winning the peak and going through all sorts of trials and tribulations with winning the Cardiff Bay competition twice and it being taken from her to the point where she finally essentially got Cincinnati built, which, as I said, was a 20-year period of struggle. And I wondered if maybe, Frank, because you're so celebrated and so many wonderful things are written about, have you had periods like that in your practice where you were actually struggling and where everything wasn't firing on all cylinders, where you had to, well, get a loan from Philip Johnson or weren't getting things built? Were there any down times?
I think so.
Is this conversation one of them?
No, I pretty much, I didn't take any business practice courses or anything, but I had a sense from the beginning that I knew that borrowing money was a bad thing to do. I didn't have a lot of money. We were really not in poverty, but difficulty. But when I started, I wouldn't borrow money. And I made another rule that everybody that worked for me would get paid. So I wouldn't take any freebie labor. And I also added to that at the end of the year they would get a bonus. So for 5 years, I worked alone day and night by myself.
But stuck to your guns.
I did. And I think that works, by the way. I think I would advise people to understand that. Now, there are ways to borrow money, and if it's family money and stuff like that, it doesn't get you in trouble maybe, but.
Peter, did you ever pay the money back?
No. Not in so many words. No, I accepted the gift. I remember, I think it's important to put him into perspective too, because there were lean years. We went out to UCLA, again, Robert was with us, for a thing called 7 Days in May, I believe what was called at UCLA in '74, okay?
Oh my God.
Well, this is, and
He was having his midlife crisis.
and we were all of the Eastern architects. The Venturis were there, Scully was there, Colin Rowe. Everybody went. White, Grays, you know, whatever. And we were invited by the Silvers, okay? And the Silvers were Caesar Pelli. No, that's the story. We had Caesar and Tony Lumsden and et cetera. I can't remember. He knows all of the names. And we were going to all give lectures at UCLA. And the first day, there were lectures. I was wearing a UCLA shirt, I remember. And he remembers that. And so everybody said, there's a party at this garage, and we were all in big fancy Cadillac cars, and we drove up to this garage and went there. And I asked one of the guys from the Silvers, I said, whose garage is this? I mean, or it's a big place, right? And there were 100 people there, and it was a very festive party. And they said, "It's that guy over there," right? And I said, "Who's he?" And he said, "Yeah, he's Frank Gehry." And I said, "Why is he giving the party?" He's an architect, but he wasn't good enough to be in the Silvers, right? That was a true story.
Yes, it was.
Yeah. That was my first introduction to Frank. So he also went through periods of time where the world was problematic.
Well, there was a backstory. I'm not going to mention names, but
Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead.
I wasn't invited, but 2 people that worked for me were put on the Silvers. And they were using my buildings. And I remember sitting with Hadid, and the person was lecturing and was showing the Concord Pavilion, and John looked at me and said, "You did that, right?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Why is he?" I said, "Because he's a Silver." At the time, I was doing developer work and wasn't considered, intellectual enough for the group or something. So I went to ULI, Urban Land Institute, in Texas for a conference with shopping center developers and stuff. And a gentleman that will remain nameless was part of that event and spoke about architecture and spoke about the New York architect community. And he was sort of deprecatory about, he didn't mention names, but he just said, that's not for developers, this is a different culture. But he's rather negative about them.
The New York Five.
Yeah. And so then I came back to LA, and I was supposed to go to Harvard to the Urban Design Conference, which I used to go to regularly because I spent some time at Harvard. Am I allowed to mention that? Just a little bit of time, not a lot. I've been here longer. Anyway, I was going to leave that afternoon, on a Monday afternoon. I had the tickets and everything. I was going to leave for Boston. And something curious, I went to UCLA to the Silvers conference, and that person who spoke at the ULI got up, and turns out he was a great friend of the Whites, the Silvers, and the Grays, and everybody. And he spoke just the opposite. He was saying just the opposite in this conference. And I thought, what the hell's going on here? And then Peter gets up and starts, who I was terrified of, because there was one of the guys in my office, Craig Hodgetts, I think it was, that knew you. And he would...
He was a Yale graduate.
Yeah, and he was always telling me, look, Peter's this genius, and he made him, appear, don't go near him. He's
Scary.
he's scary. So out of curiosity, I went, and there's Peter. Follows this gentleman who is now saying nice things about him, who said bad things about him before. And he's got his sweater on, and he's described...
Same sweater, I'm sure.
Same sweater.
It said UCLA.
Right?
Yeah,
And he's
UCLA.
saying, talking about his process, and he's describing the euphoria he has with drawing and how it takes him into another Zen mood into outer space, and he's describing this. And so it sounded like all my artist friends who got stoned all the time. It sounded familiar. And I kind of liked what he was showing, house 6 or 4 or something, which I didn't understand, that the stairway to nowhere and the master bedroom bed had a slice through it, so
That part I understand.
My parents would definitely understand.
anyway, it sounded good. So I then canceled Boston and had a party at my loft, my office, my garage. But I invited all my artist friends for protection, so I had everybody.
That's right.
That all became famous later, but they were all there. And supported me and protected me from these bad people. Anyway, we became friends. I got hustled big time, and I ended up putting $5,000 into the institute.
With Phillips 10.
And started going to meetings and fell in love with this lovable creature.
Well, it's interesting because we have, for the admitted students, the New York Five was the group of whites, which were more
Right.
Nouveau modernism.
Neo-modernist.
Neo-modernist. I'd say Bob Stern was one of the grays, which was postmodernist historicist, and I think the Silvers are described as more technologically interested, a West Coast group. I guess it's interesting because we have some, well, you didn't quite make it, but you're an honorary Silver now. I'm sure they didn't make you. How important was it having a group like that? Like practicing with a group, or at least having an affiliation with a group of other architects that supported a similar idea? How important was it having a kind of cabal moving forward in your early career?
Oh, I mean, first of all, if you're competitive, which a lot of architects are, I am very competitive. I mean, today is like nirvana for me, being competitive against Harvard, you know, one of the great excitements, right? I mean, you know, this is a day you want to win. Okay? No, it's true. I mean, you got to have competitive juices flowing today, or you're nowhere, right? And if you're competitive, you got to have a team. And there was Robert and I, who is no less competitive. We had two teams, and sometimes we play against one another. Sometimes we play together. It was really in those days very important. And we used to have meetings. We had conferences. I mean, we would, you know, invent things to do because none of us had very many other things to do. And it was, in those days, the way we survived. I think to all of the people that were involved, we look back, I mean, Robert and I would look back, and I think Frank would too, to say, you know, would we had some teams today of young people, would there be those kinds of struggles? Because thought we were struggling over something pretty important. I mean, it looks back and you say, not so. But we thought it was important at those days, and because we did believe in what we were doing, and we did have a commitment, and there were a lot of energy poured into those kinds of things. And, you know, would one like to see that today? You betcha.
You don't think there's teams today?
You seem to think there's a team that the triple O's, but I ain't convinced. I mean, I don't see them play much.
What's a triple O?
Oh, don't get started.
Don't get excited. No.
I threw it out for Frank to see
Well,
if he was.
as Oscar Wilde said, the only thing worse than being talked about is not being talked about, so at least we made the cut in
Yeah.
your mind. But that's a subject for another symposium. I wanted to, well, Frank, you had a kind of group, but I know you were really heavily influenced by the art community, and you had a lot of artist friends, it seems like. And when these guys were mostly hanging out with architects, can you maybe talk about that early interdisciplinary play between your artist side and your architecture side?
Yeah,
Yep.
yeah. So There was a small architecture group in LA that existed. And when I did the Danziger studio, there was a lot of shooting at me because instead of having the window flush with the exterior plaster, I recessed it. And so I created a sort of a fake poché that didn't exist on the inside. That was a terrible
Danger. Yeah.
thing to have done for these people, and so they started yelling at me. I didn't care much about what they were talking about. I was really looking for a way of working that was about building, about making things, not necessarily going in the shop and banging, doing stuff, but to get closer to the construction, because some of my early days before architecture, I was a truck driver and I used to install breakfast nooks and things like that, and I was always doing things with my hands. And during the course of the building of the Danziger studio, several of the artists, I would find them on the construction site. So I became friends with them because they were positively interested in what I was doing. I knew their work. I knew them from their work. I'd followed their work already, so I knew who they were. Mm. And to get invited into the club, so where they were working, where they would come to my place, I was working, and it was kind of a very hands-on thing. Many of them were building their own studios off and on, changing it. A couple of them would change, you'd go to dinner Saturday night and you'd sit in one part of the studio and it would be all set up like a stage set, and then 2 weeks later it would be in another part of the studio. And different paintings, and I liked the dynamic of it. I liked the immediacy of it, the directness of it. I could understand it, I could get into it, and I wanted to keep doing that. It was different than what the architects were doing. Right. And it engaged me a lot.
By the way, just so we don't leave anybody out, Deborah Berke was on a team too.
Yeah.
She hasn't spoken much about it.
No,
but
she's next.
She, what? You were on a team?
Go ahead.
No, I'm not going to say. I wanted you to get into the conversation.
You're very kind. I wasn't going to talk about it.
No, I was going to ask who was your...
She was on a team.
Bow.
She was
Who
on
was
a
your team.
Yeah.
You mean the Young Architects at the Institute?
No. I may be wrong. Weren't you involved in a magazine?
A couple of magazines.
Okay, sorry.
No,
Deborah.
you were being kind and gracious, and I appreciate that, but...
Come on, that was a team.
Have you left your team behind?
No.
Not at all. But the team I remember and being important and were the people I hung out with in New York when I moved back to New York after college, and they were artists and writers, and we occupied the city of the night. And I think my ongoing interest with sort of invading old buildings and transforming them has to do with that urban existence early in my career. I don't think this is the team that Peter is actually talking about, but these were my teammates, and we haunted the then dangerous streets of New York City and invaded buildings in a variety of ways. And that remains my muse.
All right.
She knows what team I'm talking about.
Peter's trying to start something.
No, I'm not. I wanted to get her in the conversation. I wanted to make sure that everybody, she also was part of, it was the way the world was.
Are you on a team now?
Me now? No.
Hey, wait a minute, I thought,
You're on this team.
I'm just kidding.
I mean, this is a team is sort of an outlier group, right? This is not an outlier group, I wouldn't say.
Well, I think I have a final question, and then we'll open it up to the
Yeah.
audience a little bit. But with Frank's permission, could I read that first statement you made in the art forum?
Sure.
Sure. Okay. So Frank wrote a piece regarding Zaha in art forum, and the first paragraph is, I think, a good place to at least start a question that'll end it. My friend Zaha died yesterday morning. She was a mere 65 years old. When I saw her last, it was a couple of weeks ago at the Yale University Architecture School, where we were both teaching studios this term, something that we have been doing regularly over the years. We do it not only because we like to teach, but also because we like being together when we teach. So over the years, we have managed to arrange our schedules to be at Yale at that time so that we can meet and greet and talk and drink and complain and have fun and explore the wonderful culture of Yale University. I guess my final question to each of you is, why do you teach and why Yale?
Go ahead, Frank. Frank's been teaching the
Since the
longest.
80s.
Oh, Peter taught first before.
Yeah.
You taught here in 80, started teaching here in the early
78.
78. Okay.
Yeah.
And then Frank taught before you.
No, I don't think, I mean, I was taking when, I would be a visiting critic when Jim was here. I mean, I would be on juries, on Jim's juries all the time, but
I was teaching.
doesn't matter.
I was teaching parallel with Jim.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't, yeah. I can answer the question. I'm here because of Bob. And we are all here. I think one of the things that one needs to do is appropriately give credit where credit has been due for 18 years. And I had the choice of being at Princeton or here, and I was really ready to go to Princeton, and Bob said, you got to come here. And it was really important for him to make that gesture, and it was important for me to take it in the way it was made. And for me, teaching is one of the three important things in my professional life that I do. And it is very important to me. I never miss a beat with teaching. Building is important, and writing's important. And to me, I get a lot of energy from every time I teach, because you're in touch with brighter people than you are, faster people. And if you're competitive,
You're
baby.
talking about the young faculty, right?
No, I'm talking about the young students, okay? And they get younger and faster and brighter every year. So and one of the older guys, the silverbacks, and all the new guys, right? And that combination is very important, right? And to having had somebody watch over one, which Robert does, right? And to give us a fleet of young horses, fabulous, nothing better. And Yale has always been that kind of place, and I know that Deborah in that tradition. It's always been, as Robert would say, it's a standalone architecture school. It has always had an architect who practices in an important way as a dean, right? And it's unique in the firmament of architecture schools since the war, since the Second World War. I can't speak before that because that's his purview, but
Next week's lecture.
what?
That'll be next week's lecture.
Next year. But
Is that how you divide the world
I think
pre-war,
that
Bob?
I think that to have here tonight the Grand Seigneur, Bob, Deborah, fabulous. You know, for them, unbelievable. And it could only happen here.
Yeah.
By total accident that one of our great friends and colleagues passed, and we were able to put this group together. Terrific.
I teach because it feels good, that makes it selfish. It does good, that makes it generous, and it feels best here. That was easy. And I would say, I never talked to Zaha about this, but I would reckon she might say the same thing about coming here to teach.
There's a freedom, a willing to explore, a willing to put collisions together. I was put on a Leon Creer jury once.
Bob's over there going.
Leon, who finally became friends with me after he realized that I had read the Camilo Sitta book. And I quoted from it once, and oh my God.
On the friend list.
But then he didn't like me after I did the Eisenhower Memorial, so
Right.
I'm in good shape. But I think there's that kind of open, friendly kind of controversy that goes on, and it's probably, I don't know any other place where you can pull it off. And it's been done. This, with Bob at the head of it, he took it to a whole new place that it hadn't been, and I think we learned a lot from that.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I think we'll open the floor to a couple
Yeah.
of questions if we have time. And I believe there's a microphone person there. Okay. So if you have a question, raise your hand.
There got to
Speak
be
into the mic.
questions. They can't be all dead.
No, they will. You just have to give them time.
There's a question there, but we need to get the mic because there are people in other rooms.
Thank you for the discussion. Peter mentioned the sort of irreplicability of Zaha's authority, but I guess I just want to ask how that might be compared to, say, Frank Lloyd Wright, who was some sort of idiosyncratic and irascible authority in architecture, who in many ways saw to it that his authority was replicated, and whether that was something of Zaha's agenda to make her design aesthetic into a style, into a goal for designers.
Good question.
Well, when I started school in 50, I'm a little behind Frank. Frank started in 30, I think, but when I started in 50, everybody had Frank Lloyd Wright books on their desks. They had The Nature of Materials, they had any number of Frank Lloyd Wright books, and it was the authority in the school, because it was a Beaux-Arts school, and we weren't doing Beaux-Arts, but we were doing the next best thing to it, was Frank Lloyd Wright. And I can tell you from personal experience, a personal story. In '52, we had Paul Rudolph as a critic, and Paul set a project, and I was in his studio, and I did a Frank Lloyd Wright project, and the juries were closed in those days, but when they opened the doors, I went in, and I had gotten the highest mark in the class of first mention from doing absolutely, practically tracing Frank Lloyd Wright. So the next project was a yacht club, and I had remembered from reading my books that Frank Lloyd Wright had done a thing called the Yahara Boat Club. So I traced off the Yahara Boat Club and turned it in, and I was really excited when I heard Paul Rudolph was coming back to be on our jury in '52, and I thought, hey, another top grade, right? And so I raced in after the jury was over, and there was a big X, which in those days meant you had failed the 6 weeks, and it caused me to go to a summer school to make up the 6 weeks, because you couldn't do it any other way. And I went up to Mr. Rudolph, and I said, Mr. Rudolph, what's the story here? The last time I got a first mention, and this time I got a chop. And he said, it's okay to do it once, not twice. And it was a big lesson.
Another question?
Well, then, if not, I think we'll thank Mark for putting together a wonderful set of questions, and our great speakers and guests and faculty, Frank Gehry, Deborah Berke, Peter Eisenman, for sharing their thoughts about Zaha and about themselves.